Good morning and welcome to our second webcast on the future of work. The series focused on adapting to change. This series is focused on the impacts of COVID-19 and how it's accelerated the future of work. Today our focus is going to be on the need for adaptation for individuals, leadership, and company culture. My name is Simon Chan. I'm the Vice President of Talent Academy and Future Work at Communitech. And I can't tell you how excited I am to hear from our speakers today, Heather McGowan and Carol Lehman. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. First, I want to talk a little bit about our charity campaign, This Too Will Pass. Communitech launched an important charity campaign last week to support the urgent needs of our community. And our generous tech friends and partners have offered to triple all donations to the Cato Family Foundation through this campaign. We've raised $33,000, and of which has already been matched by $100,000. Also like to thank our Future of Work and Learning Coalition partners for making this event possible. These 19 different organizations have continued to champion the future of work conversation on a community level, and I'm grateful for the support that they provided. Some quick housekeeping items. The webcast is going to last an hour. You entered with your mics automatically muted. We'll ask that you remain muted to avoid any background noise, and encourage you to be part of the conversation using the chat function. While we're in presentation for part of the webinar, I recommend you use select speaker mode for your screen. You can do that at the top right-hand corner, and we'll send you a post-event email with the recording and details about the next event. If you have any questions, please email us. By way of agenda, we're going to be here for a full packed hour. And first, what we'll do is we'll hear from Heather McGowan. She's going to share her thoughts and her thesis on the future of work and her perspective on how COVID-19 has accelerated the future of work. We'll then move to a moderated discussion where Carol Lehman and Heather will join me, and we'll talk about the importance of culture and leadership during these turbulent times. If time permits, we'll take a question or two to share your questions through the Q&A function. So I'm extremely excited to introduce our speakers today. I've been following Heather's work for about a year now, and we're really lucky to have her. Carol has also been one of our biggest supporters of the Future of Work Coalition, and I really appreciate her time and energy today. So let me just give you a little bit of background. Heather is a future of work strategist. She helps leaders prepare their people and organizations for the fourth industrial revolution. She's a keynote speaker who takes very, very complicated concepts and simplifies them into really interesting, rich frameworks and powerful metaphors that she'll share with us today. In 2017, LinkedIn ranked her as the #1 global voice for education. And Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman describes her as the oasis of the future of work. And I, for those who know me, know I love Tom Friedman. Heather believes in that success in the future of work centers around our ability to learn, unlearn, and adapt. And to succeed, we need to let go of the way we've done things before, and most importantly, our professional identities. Leaders need to get comfortable with failure, unknowns, ambiguity, and vulnerability to create the requisite psychological safety to lead our teams. Heather recently co-authored the book, The Adaptation Advantage, and she'll share some segments from there as well. Carol is the CEO of Exonify, which is a micro-learning platform and delivers personalized, bite-sized, targeted learning in fun and interactive ways. Carol's been a thought leader with an impressive track record of leading tech entrepreneurs and growing companies. She was the former CEO of PostRank, and she's won a number of awards, including Canada's leading female high-tech entrepreneur. So we're pleased to have Heather and Carol today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Heather, at this time to talk a little bit about your future of work thesis and how COVID-19 has accelerated aspects of the future of work. So thank you, Heather.
Great, thank you, Simon. Thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Originally, I was supposed to be, I think, up there seeing you guys in person, and I look forward to doing something like that fairly soon. For every Zoom, I pick a different background, and for this background, I am actually in Provincetown, Massachusetts today, and I took this photo here of a fishing boat that crashed on the rocks a couple years ago in a major storm. And everybody was hand-wringing on like how they were going to get it out of there. The boat looked really badly damaged. There was talk of cranes and helicopters and all sorts of stuff. And I feel like that's a little bit of a metaphor for our economy right now. Nobody can see their way through it yet, but with some ingenuity, they patched up that boat, they floated up, went back out to sea and it's fishing today. And I think that will be true for us as well. We need hope, we need innovation, we need trust, we need psychological safety. And those are all things I'm going to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to quickly take you through my thesis on the future of work. So the theme of this discussion today is the future of work is now. I couldn't be more in agreement on that. And so I'm going to take you through, my thesis on the future of work tracks pretty well with the book that Chris Shipley and I just wrote called The Adaptation Advantage. The book has 3 key points, as does this talk, which is, the first is that the future of work is learning and adaptation. The second is that in order to do that, we not only have to let go of the way we've always done it, but equally and perhaps even more important, who we think we are. I'm going to talk about how identity plays into that. And then we're going to finish the discussion, and I think that's going to lead into our discussions today as well as later on this afternoon, about how leadership requires you to be comfortable with ambiguity and vulnerability, allowing us to be champions of human potential and learning tours filled with the unknown. And I would also add the unknown unknowns, and my goodness, is the coronavirus one of those right now. So part 1, I'm going to take it through 3 parts. The book tracks 3 parts, but so does this talk. I call this Adapting at the Speed of Change, and this is the coronavirus edition of that. So first, we are entering, or we are amidst really, the greatest velocity of change in human history. At the same time, we've made the greatest leaps in human longevity. So for example, if you were born in 1750 when the steam engine came out, life expectancy was 37 years. You and the generations around you had 2.5 generations to absorb the impact of that change. Fast forward today, even before the virus, which is an accelerant I'll talk about in a second, depending on your age, you could have 2, 3, 4, or 5 paradigm shifts within a single generation. We're not ready for that. And that's been thrust upon us at lightning speed with this virus. So when we talk about the velocity of change, we've really been talking about how technology has driven this acceleration and change, technology and globalization, but a lot of it's technology. But human adaptation has long been linear. So exponential steps are, each step is double the prior step. And exponential technology-driven change is exactly following that path, as does the virus. But something really interesting happened about 60 days ago. And the coronavirus, I think, became an accelerant to that. And people talk about it being an accelerant to digital transformation, but digital transformation is simply human transformation. And what amazes me is how quickly, it's been about 63 or 64 days now since the World Health Organization declared this global pandemic. But really in the first 14 days, a tremendous amount of change took place. And I think people, and everybody on this call, should congratulate yourselves. You have done a tremendous amount of adaptation in a very short period of time. And I started tracking, how things changed across who we are and what we do, how we do it, and where we do it. The center of this, I call it BC, before coronavirus. And since then, kind of where and how we work has changed. For some of us, it's working from home, which may be difficult and frustrating because you don't have the right space or there are too many people in your home, but largely we're safe. For other folks, work became a dangerous place. You didn't used to have to wear life-saving equipment when you delivered packages or worked in a grocery store or drove a bus, but now you're putting your life in your hands so that we can sit comfortably at home. And I appreciate the gratitude that's happened around that. What and how we do it, just about every company has had to rework some form of process. Some companies have pivoted their supply chains or pivoted their product lines. And every leader out there who's succeeding is doing so by leading with trust, because you no longer have your people in your physical proximity. So you have to establish psychological safety and trust to lead them. Who works and what we do, we've got a tremendous amount of role fluidity taking place where we'll have to be comfortable taking on different roles in our organization as our organizations are adapting to this rapid change. Parents out there, my God, thank you for everything you're doing. You are now, as well as teachers. Parents are also teachers, so now you have 2 jobs at home. And I think we need to have as much empathy and understanding for parents out there acting as teachers. All of us have to increase our adaptability. Many of us are going to have to learn. In the US, we've lost 30 million some odd jobs. many of those are not going to come back, or not going to come back in the same way. So there's a massive reskilling, upskilling, learning, and adaptability that needs to take place. And then the last one, kind of who works and where we do it. In order for this to work effectively, whether it's learning online, remote working, or even work in a dangerous place, we need to establish trust and psychological safety between managers and leaders and teams, and between each other. And one of my questions is, and I'll leave this out there and we can revisit it in the discussion group, is how many of these things should snap back to the center to before coronavirus? There's lots of talk about when we go back. We're not going back, we're going forward. And which of these things should we carry forward because they're positive and they improve the human condition and the work experience? And which one of those things should we better prepare for so we don't put people in these spaces again? So my kind of central thesis on how work has changed that we haven't quite adapted to yet, and this is a big sort of mindset shift, is that work and life used to exist like this. It was education, career, retire, 3 discrete bands that did not overlap. Education, whether you went to university or not, was just the first third of your life, sufficient only to get you on the career escalator, collect a pension, and by design die a year later. Success measures here are to be codify and transfer the right predetermined skills and existing knowledge in you to get you on that career ladder. If we did that, all was good. Now, life expectancy may not be 90 yet, but it will be soon. Education becomes learning because learning implies there's no end state. Career becomes leverage of that learning to signal that work and learning are now a combined act. And retirement becomes longevity because we didn't plan for, save for it, nor should we really have a 30-year retirement. It's not good for us. Many of us can't afford it financially, but it's not good for us cognitively or psychologically to disengage for that long. So it looks more like this. So people describe it as waves, rock climbing, traversing a web. We'll now have many different overlapping types of work that will require integrated learning. We'll remain engaged later in life. And our success measures here, and this is a big shift we have to make in our learning institutions as well as in our workplace, is a constant cycle of learning and adapting to create new value. Seems like a very simple thing, but that's a shift from a fixed occupational identity and a one-time training to a fluid occupational identity and ongoing learning. So I say that in the past, we learned once in order to work. Now we'll have to work in order to learn continuously. In the past, that identity was bestowed upon us. It was externally validated, which means it can often be taken away. And now we need to build more self-actualized, internally validated identities that will allow us to learn and adapt for life. So looking into how technology is reshaping work, one of the things that I noticed a couple of years ago is the only thing moving faster than technology is societal and cultural changes. And those societal cultural changes are making it, some folks finally comfortable and some folks very uncomfortable. And if you're feeling uncomfortable by some of these societal and cultural changes, it's very difficult to be vulnerable enough to learn and adapt. And so that's why the identity piece is so crucial to the work piece. So these questions we ask ourselves and each other, who are you? What do you do? And where are you from, are all becoming a little unmoored, and they're changing a little bit. So I track 14 dimensions right now of societal and cultural change. A lot of them are US based. Most of them are the developed world, so they're applicable. I kind of change them by markets, but I think all of these fit Canada pretty well. Racially, I'm not sure. So in the US, we're going from a white majority to the white population will no longer be a majority in our lifetimes, or many of our lifetimes. It's been in the works for decades. Religion, we've been a Judeo-Christian norm. Now we have more folks who are unaffiliated to any religion or belong to a plurality of religions beyond Judeo-Christian. Globally, the Muslim religion will eclipse Christianity in the next couple of decades, so it's a global trend that's taking place. In the US, we have more folks who are atheist. Harvard has been around for 400 something years. 2019, they had their first graduating class with more atheists than Christians. And since Pew Research has been tracking church membership, we're at the lowest level in recorded history. We act like we're a youth and middle-aged culture, but in reality, in all of the developed world, for the most part, we are an aging society. Family, we still act like family as mom and dad and 2.5 kids. I am a middle child. I am now extinct. We're below population replacement in much of the developed world. We're having fewer kids with more types of families. 40% of the kids in the US are born outside the institution of marriage. We've had marriage equality for about a decade. So we have all sorts of family types. We haven't quite caught up with that. The fastest moving marker I see is gender identity, where it was fixed in binary just a few years ago. It's decidedly fluid now. They was added to Oxford and the Webster's dictionaries to indicate a non-gender binary person, was also picked as the word of the year last year. Education, we still act like a single dose is sufficient. It is not. We need continuous learning. That's a different expectation, and that's different institutions we need. Truth and trust, we used to trust. We had the fairness doctrine until 1987 in the US. We used to trust our institutions. We used to trust our news. Now we're decidedly fragmented on that, where we end up trusting ourselves and each other more than our experts, which is frightening right now, when we should be trusting science. Consent and power, it was when women joined the workforce in the 70s, absolutely explicitly permissible to sexually harass a woman, and some men as well. Me Too and Time's Up movement has reshaped some of that, more at the upper levels, not throughout organizations. Restaurant Industry Association survey report found that 90% of people who work in the service industry report some form of sexual harassment. So we have much more to do there, but it is changing. Occupation, we had a fixed occupational identity. I don't know if it's a portfolio of self-expression, but we need some way to talk differently about all the things we do and how they're connected to our purpose. Leadership and authority, white guys, you have had a great run. We're seeing more diversity in leadership, gender, racial, neurological, cognitive diversity, all types of diversity, so that now our leaders are starting to look more like the tribes they lead. Expertise was earned and credentialed. And I still think it should be, particularly in the scientific community, but not everybody's gonna get their platform by a job they had, a company they work for, a degree they had. Case in point, I am Zooming this to you guys from Provincetown, Massachusetts. I started writing and speaking about these things partly out of frustration that I didn't think anybody was explaining the world of work the way I saw it evolving. My second article, 100,000 people read it in 24 hours. I started getting speaking requests all over the world, and now this is all I do. I think this may be how many people work, which is figuring out what your purpose is, figuring out how you create value, putting it out there, developing a personal brand, developing a personal network, and forming a job around that. Human relationships have long been face-to-face, and I do hope they do return to be sometime soon. Before the virus, we were spending 51% of our time in the developed world online. You can just look at your phone and your screen time. It's not hard to track that. And all that means is that we're sitting next to someone often we're not connecting with. We don't know our neighbors. Some of that with the virus I see returning, which I think is really interesting. And then populations in the world, top 10 populations in the world were countries until 5 or 6 years ago. Right now, the only 2 of the top 10 populations in the world are countries. The rest are social media platforms. And that happened really quickly. And that is a different societal dynamic. So if you look at this list collectively, the top 5 or 6 are who we think we are, or how we think we define ourselves, what we do for work, or how we express ourselves, and where we're from or where we belong. And when all these things are sort of in some form of flux, it makes some people, again, more comfortable, some other people uncomfortable. We gave this talk in the Midwest in the United States, this particular piece of it, and an older gentleman in the front row was sitting there looking at me like this, and I thought, oh, great. And then afterwards, he made a beeline to talk to me, and he said, I'm a white, straight Christian male from the Midwest. I lost my job, I found a new one, but I don't know where I fit, I don't know where I behave. You have to keep talking about this stuff because there are a lot of us out there who are having trouble adapting, and we need to have conversations about it. I thought that was a great point, and so I promised him I would continue to do so. The real point here is, if we all have to keep learning and adapting, and I do believe we have to create a space where people can feel vulnerable, so they can feel comfortable letting go, saying I don't know, saying I failed. Something Carol, who's going to speak after me, does very, very well. So second part of this, let go and learn fast to thrive. One of the things that's happened with the virus is an increased level of empathy and gratitude, which I find really inspiring. Brene Brown, who's one of the people that I follow, has started talking about how the virus is an FFT. It's not ducking, it's never ducking if you've ever had your text messages corrected. But this is what her word for it, that this is the first time you do anything is really hard. We're all in this collective moment of vulnerability. So one of the things we can do as leaders, as coworkers, as parents, and as friends is acknowledge we're all in this sort of freak out first time. And we'll make our way through it, but we have to lead with empathy. We have to lead with establishing trust. So one of the things that I think we have sort of upside down when we think about workers, and we think about leading, and we think about preparing people for work or screening talent for organizations is an iceberg that I use. At the top of that is the skills you're hired to do. So you're hired into a certain position, they look that you have the requisite skills to do it. It's a fraction of what they really need to know about you, but it's what we can see and it's what we focus on a little bit to our peril. At the waterline are the enablers. They're the uniquely human skills that make us better at what we do, better at learning and adapting, better as coworkers, better as parents, better as partners, better as friends. We've left a lot of these uniquely human skills behind in our system of education and our systems of work, and we're starting to see a sort of a return to that. Below that is the mindset that allows us to learn and adapt. I call it an agile learning mindset, somewhat similar to Carol Dweck's growth mindset, but it has some additional elements to it. And then at the base of that is that identity piece. Do you feel some resilience, some understanding of your purposes, which is something I'll get into next. So we pack learning in the first third of your life because we have this belief that your cognitive fluidity is greatest before the age of 20. Turns out that's true, but the rest of the research we have on cognition comes from the 1970s. In the 1970s, we didn't have cable TV. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have social media. We didn't have 280 newspapers of data coming at us a day. We had fewer than 40. So our cognition has actually changed, and there's some recent studies that look at how we learn across the lifespan that point out some really interesting peaks that I think we should be capitalizing on. So fluid intelligence does peak at 20, and then crystallized intelligence, which is like your encyclopedic knowledge, peaks later. For some folks, it's 60, 70, 80, 60 is about the average. Our executive function doesn't fully form until we're almost 30. Our prefrontal cortex, the executive part of our brain, doesn't form them. So we ask students to pick a future self before they have the cognitive ability to do so and understand that. Our ability to concentrate at 43, reading emotions at 48, learning new information, deeply learning new information at 50. And I'm playing words with friends a lot lately, and I'm losing to everybody. Don't play with anybody over 67. They're going to kick your butt. So the World Economic Forum looked at about 5 years ago, the skills they thought we would need in 2020. And I think it's interesting how it's turning out with the virus. I think it's also interesting to look at where our cognitive peaks line up with those skills. So I kind of divide into before 30 and after 40. So before 30, cognitive flexibility does peak before 30. Critical thinking, complex problem solving, and creativity, there's a big range for different folks on that. After 40, people management, coordinating with others, emotional intelligence, judgment, decision-making, service orientation, and negotiation. Those are almost all things that require collaboration to learn about them, require time, which is why they peak later in life. So as we digitize more of the economy, and we've been lunging at youth in order to do that because they have digital skills and because they have cognitive fluidity, we're starting to see another shift take place. So IBM did a study and looked at in 2016 and 2018, asking CEOs all over the world, what are the most important skills for your business? They had a list of 12, I narrowed it down to 10. And they're a combination of technical and human skills, and something very interesting happened between 2016 and 2018. So in 2016, the technical skills were the most important. 2018, the human skills became the most important. Why that shift? I think we've digitized more of our economy, one. Two, I think more of us have digital skills, so they're not something they ask about, they're sort of assumed. And we're now starting to see how we've left behind human skills and how we need to bring those back. So if you look at the overall trends, the blue being the human skills, they're bubbling up. The gray being technical skills, they're going down. Not to say technical skills are not important. Research we cover in our book from Burning Glass found that technical skills depreciate if you have only technical skills, because there's always somebody behind you learning new technical skills who are going to know them better than you because they're spending all their time on the next tool, software, etc. But the human skills appreciate with time because they appreciate with exposure. And so those people with technical and human skills are in the best position for the future. So the agile learning mindset that I mentioned has 4 A's because I like alliteration. It's first, agency. Understanding learning is your responsibility. Agile learning mindset connects the head and the heart. So it connects to, in order to learn and adapt for life, we have to understand our purpose because it's our fuel source, our curiosity, our passion. And that's something that we discover over time. It's not something you discover one day. It's a lifelong process of discovery. Second is our learning agility, our ability to learn, unlearn, and adapt. Then it's our adaptability, our ability to navigate ambiguity, unstructured problems like really this moment right now. And then last, in some ways, most importantly, it's overall awareness, but I look specifically at market awareness and self-awareness. Self-awareness is knowing yourself, knowing what you're good at, know what you need help with, knowing what you need to work on. That's a big part of learning and adaptation. The other part of it is market awareness. You can no longer work for a company where you say, this is my job, I don't know what the company does or how it makes money, because your company's business model is not going to last for your career. Chances are good. Your company's business model is going to change. So if you don't know how your company creates value and then how you contribute to that value creation, you're not in the best position to continuously adapt. So you have to think about yourself the way Simon Sinek talks about starting with a why, and I think starting with a why with you. So starting with your purpose, what energizes you? What is it that you get up in the morning thinking about? What is the first thing you do when you have a list of tasks? Next is your how, your powers. What are your superpowers? What are you good at? How are you expanding that? How are you porting that? How are you refreshing that? And then you apply it to a moment in time in your profession, which is how you engage your abilities and values to express yourself. Because if you're going to have 5 or 6 different jobs, 17 according to the Foundation for Young Australians, across 4 or 5 different industries, you have to start with your purpose and your superpowers, not the what, because you're going to have a lot of whats. So how do you lead people in this new normal? It's a fairly big shift. A few different people have looked at what make them highest performing teams. I like Google's Project Aristotle because it's data-based. They looked at 180 teams over a couple of years and said, is it same gender, different gender, same age, different age, people who know each other, collective IQ, people who don't know each other? What are the top 4 or 5 characteristics for high performing teams in accelerated learning, which is the moment we're in? And they discovered there's one factor that stood above all the rest, as did Dr. Amy Edmondson, who coined the term from her research in healthcare, and that's psychological safety. Can you establish the conditions on your team, which Carol does very well, where you say, I don't have all the answers. This is what we're trying to do. You have dependability. Everybody is accountable. You have clarity about what you're doing. The work that you're doing has meaning and it connects to your purpose. Those are their 5, but the first and foremost was psychological safety. Can you lead with vulnerability? Can you establish trust? Can you make the environment on the team where everybody feels like they can show up with their whole selves, raise their hand when they need help, raise their hand when they made a mistake so you can collectively correct it? Because if you lead with impression management, which is I'm pretending I have all the answers, you're signaling to everybody in your team to pretend they have all the answers too. So that's when a small problem becomes a big problem because somebody hides that they don't know something or they made a mistake and they try to cover it and it all becomes worse. Dr. Allison Reynolds and Dr. David Lewis did some research and they said, yes, psychological safety is important, but in accelerated learning, you also need something else. And they consider that cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity are people who think differently than you. So and they said teams fall into 4 quadrants. So if you have a team that has low cognitive diversity, people think similarly, and low psychological safety, it's sort of a CYA environment. People are always trying to cover for themselves. It's a little defensive. If you have a team that has some high level of cognitive diversity, but low level of psychological safety, you often have a couple of bullies in there. And that's oppositional, not optimal for learning. And then the teams that too many of us form are uniform, which are low cognitive diversity because we hired all the people who think like we do. We all get along great. We're all happy. We're all hugging all the time and nothing ever gets done. So the kinds of teams you want to build, and this is a real stretch for us, particularly as leaders, is to hire that person who asks you a question that rocked you back on your heels because they thought of something you hadn't thought of. They could see around your blind spots. They could check the gaps in your knowledge. That's the kind of team you want to cultivate, but you want to establish psychological safety so everybody feels safe in that environment. Everybody has to show up, and that's called generative. So every organization, I believe, has to focus on culture and capacity. And the first part of that is to define your culture, which is very simple but very difficult. First, your mission. Why do you exist? Second, your vision. How does the world look differently because you exist? And then your values. What will and won't you do to achieve your vision and mission? 3 simple questions, very hard for most folks to answer. And in organizations, we tend to focus on our outputs. We talk about our brands and our products, which are really just exhaust from our learning, because our brand is just an expression of our culture, and our products are really evidence of our capacity. So one of the examples I like to use is Netflix. 1997, Netflix was shipping DVDs by mail. 2007, they were streaming. 2011, original content. As of the end of 2019, 44% of their revenues came from original content. In order to make those 3 pivots in under 30 years, they had to focus on their culture. They had to focus on upskilling and upgrading their capacity, as did every organization who worked in that organization. If you worked for Netflix in 1997 and you say, I'm a master at shipping DVDs by mail and making sure they're not broken and supply chain logistics, that was great until 2007, when those skills weren't needed as much anymore. So you had to shift and expand your capacity. So every company is just a collection of individuals. So when you're thinking about your culture, you don't necessarily want just alignment, because then that becomes more of a cult. You want cultural add. You want people who have alignment with your passion, your purpose, your curiosity, your values, people who add to your culture and help you grow it. And then in terms of hiring talent, you want people who are focused on expanding their human potential. That's just evidence of your capacity. So this is just a shift from focusing on what you do to why and how you do it. That gives you more agility, particularly in these times. I live part-time in Manhattan, and so I watch Cuomo every day. I'm now in Boston, but usually in Boston. And he has started doing something at the end of his updates. He started doing it about a month and a half ago, where he ends every talk talking about what New York believes. He's essentially talking about the culture of the city. He says New York is tough, smart, united, disciplined, and loving. He gives points for each one of these to remind people where they are, what they believe, that we're in this together. We're in the same storm, we're in different boats. We have to acknowledge that. And one of the things I think about the virus is I think that a lot of us are looking at it like we're standing on the bank of a raging river and staring at those eddies that could just suck us in and working in panic mode, and it's completely understandable. But one of the things I think we need to do is look across that river to the other side, because I think if we're insistent and intentional, we can build a better future of work, or now of work, if we can cross that river. It's inevitable that we're going to have to cross that river. And I think one of the things that good leaders do is point out that we've already started crossing it. We've flattened the curve in many places. We've made progress on viruses. Companies have adapted incredibly fast, from distributed workforces to learning online to product lines and all the things I mentioned at the beginning. So with that, I want to turn it back over to you guys. I think Carol's going to talk, or we're going to have a discussion, but that is the little primer I organized for us today to kick off our discussion.
Thank you, Heather. That was incredible. Listening to you talk, it just makes me think about so many different things in terms of the future work, and so many different areas that we can go. So for the next, 20 minutes or so, I think what we'll do is I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about how you got connected with Carol and Exonify. I think that's a really, really cool story. We'll unpack a little bit of that leadership and adaptable organization discussion, and then leave a little bit of time to talk a bit about kind of what might the new normal look like. But Carol, I'm going to start off with you. Tell us a little bit about how Exonify and your team is adapting to COVID-19, and what are some of the things you saw in the future of work that you were thinking about pre-COVID, and then what aspects have actually now accelerated that you're thinking about, given we're in the middle of the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. So the team's adapted really well. We have the fortunate reality of being a tech company. So moving to work from home was kind of a situation of pick up your laptop and take it home. There have been, as everybody's experiencing, challenges that certain employees have had with young children at home and, needing to figure out their kind of work-life balance, for lack of a better term. But for the most part, we've adapted quite well. We are constantly thinking about the future of work, which is part of the reason why we wanted to be part of the coalition that you guys put together, as much as we did in the early days, and thinking about how we apply principles to our own people, in addition to kind of taking in what's going on out there in the world and through our product trying to help with that. So I would say things that have accelerated, and again, it's more of we were already thinking of many of these things, but we're shifting rapidly to more of the cross skilling, upskilling of internal people and giving them opportunities to participate in other parts of the business, to learn more, to contribute more, to add value in different ways. So we've done that much more quickly than we were doing it previously. The whole idea of just flexibility around work, has never been more present now, and needing to accommodate and take into consideration each individual's needs and the way that they work best given this situation have also accelerated. And those are things that aren't going to go away when, COVID is largely, we're through it and come out the other side, whatever that looks like. So lots of little things across the business that we've been adjusting, and some more rapidly than others.
Great, thanks. Heather, I must admit you've been on the circuit, the podcast circuit. Every time there's a new podcast to listen to. But in your podcast, you've actually referred to Axonify and Carol. And first time I heard it, I was like, what? A company from Waterloo region? Amazing. Can you talk a little bit about what you found intriguing about the organization? And I would just be interested to hear how you and Carol met.
Sure. So I got contacted by someone from Axonify, I think like maybe about a year ago, and they said, oh, we're having this summit. Can you give up and speak? And I said, sure. And, it just became on my schedule, like one of many things. I do probably 6 or 7 of these, sometimes a month, traveling all the time to different companies, which is really cool because I get to meet all sorts of leaders. I get to learn about companies I knew nothing about, organizations I didn't even know exist. I spoke at the Tag and Label Manufacturers of America. I mean, I don't know why they'd want to hear from me, but it was fascinating that such an organization even exists. But what I do before I go in for a talk, of course, is learn about the company, learn about the industry. And then if there are people I'm going to be talking to, I kind of do a little bit of background. I usually look them up on LinkedIn or something. And in Carol's case, I looked on, she was CEO, so I looked on Glassdoor at their reviews, and I thought it was really cool. She had like 99% approval rating, which is very, very high. And so when I remember I walked up to you, Carol, and I said, what are you doing? How'd you get that? And so we talked a little bit after my talk, and then I was in the middle of writing the book. So I called Carol and I said, can I interview you? And she said, sure. And I remember when I spoke to you on the phone, you said, whenever people leave this organization, I want them to think of it as the best place they've ever worked. And that is one of my key goals as a CEO. She also told me it was her 5th time being a CEO, which I think helps in that. You learn a lot along in that when you've been in that seat so many times. And you talked about people leaving the organization because sometimes they want to have different skills and experiences. And many of them, you want them to bring those back, and that sort of open door policy. So the culture she'd established, and one of the things you did that, which I also mentioned in the book, is the Ask Me Anything sessions. So every 2 weeks, she stands up with a screen behind her. Anything could pop up, anything can be asked. And that sort of transparency, that willingness to be vulnerable, that establishing psychological safety was everything that Chris and I found in our research. And so I found it in a CEO. So I put a spotlight on that.
That's great. Carol, you're going to blush a little bit, I think.
Yes, bright red.
So in Heather's book, and obviously in her talk today, she talked about the need for a different type of leadership, one that can handle continuous change. We're obviously in the midst of a health and economic crisis. Can you talk about what you think leaders need to focus on today during this crisis? What's maybe the number one thing as a CEO you've kind of learned during this unprecedented time?
I would say, now more than ever, it has just, come full force at me how much people look to me for steadiness, for trust, for, their trust in me that I'm telling them the truth, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. Trust that I'm going to lead them through to something good on the other side. And just that, when the world is in such chaos and there is an incredible unknown on so many levels that impact each of us, there is nobody who's not touched by this. Having me be a beacon of that steadiness, and they have confidence that I'm going to make choices that are in the best interests of the whole, and not be rash, not be, so whipped, and make quick and potentially detrimental decisions. And in fact, I'm a glass half full kind of person naturally. So I think about what are the possibilities and what are the opportunities. And yes, we have to be careful, but, hey, let's open our minds to what are the things we could do differently or better, or position ourselves for success. And, early on, I kind of couched it with the team as week 1 is just a response plan. What are we doing here? Week 2 is, the steady state plan. And then beyond weeks 3 and 4, what's our success plan? So having a mindset, and being that steady beacon has been the one thing that has paid dividends for us, for sure.
Well, and we talk a lot about leadership and how it's related to culture. So, Heather, one of the things that I'd love to hear you talk about is around company culture and what type of culture you need to thrive kind of moving forward into the future, and understanding that sense of why. One of the things that I'd ask you to tell is that the story or the tale of the chickens and the roosters, is it? About creating a team and your findings around the types of individuals you need on your teams to create a culture that can navigate this future.
Yeah, so I can tell you the super chickens or the super hens story. And if you particularly like this story, Margaret Hefferman does a great TED Talk on it. So I highly recommend that. But I came across this partly for Margaret, and then I got in touch with Dr. William Muir at Purdue, who did this research. He started in the 80s. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he said to himself, I wonder if I can breed productivity into animals. And largely this is animals as a food source for us. And so one of the groups he started with was chickens. He said, chickens are easy. You can count the eggs. That's how you can tell if they're productive. So he had a flock of 9 chickens. He would take the most productive chicken out of each flock, put them together in a flock of these kind of super hens, with the theory that you could breed this productivity into multiple generations. And when he went back to check on the hens some period of time later, he was surprised to find not only were they not productive, any more productive than had been before, only 3 of them were alive. The other 6 had pecked each other to death. And then he discovered through chickens, and then he told me he did it with all other species. So he's been doing this for 40 years, and the results are exactly the same, is that the highest productivity in that way usually comes from bullying the rest of the flock or whatever the group they're in. And what's interesting in our society is we've become this kind of star mentality. So we grade people, we rank people, we pick the best people, and we kind of focus on the individual when things rarely get done as individuals. They get done as teams. So Muir understood that, and then he went back to the chickens, the hens rather, and he said, what if I focused on the flocks that collectively work the best together and bred those flocks to continue? He did that, and he saw a 40% increase in productivity, because that's how we actually work. It's not the mortar, it's not the bricks, it's the mortar. It's the stuff that happens between people. It's stuff that happens in that psychological safety, in those dynamics, the kind of stuff that Carol does a very good job at establishing. So I just think it's an interesting that it's biological. It's not just behavioral.
Yeah, I thought it was a really fascinating study, and we see it, within organizations. But one of the things that we've been talking a lot over the last several months here is around community, and how does an ecosystem come together to help each other and be more of that collective collaborative team. So maybe I'll start with you, Carol, and just ask you around, what do you think kind of the role of an ecosystem or a community, what role can it play in helping organizations and individuals adapt to this pace of change that we're in? And what would you say are some of the priorities we should be thinking about as community leaders, given the context that we're currently in?
I do think communities have a huge role to play. And, it is kind of what Heather just mentioned in many ways to me. It's being the glue between so many disparate parts, so providing a mechanism or a venue for companies, for example, local companies to get together and actively work together. People talk about doing that a lot of the time, but organizations like Communitech take action to make it happen. And, that's absolutely essential. And also, providing thought leadership and ideas. Again, I think so many people now have heard the phrase future of work, but don't actually understand the practical aspects of what that means or how it's changing. And so, communities can come together to start to put specificity around concepts and ideas and potential actions, instead of just spinning wheels and saying it's happening, it's happening, it's happening, and having it happen to you versus having it happen with you or because of you. So I think to the extent that the grains of that can start and then grow, and people can grasp on to those tangible parts of it, is the way to make change happen, or to jump on board with the change that is happening and be active participants in it. And, each individual organization or person can do a part, but it's when it's all brought together that real step change can happen, and happen quickly.
Heather, have you've like you said, you've talked to a number of different organizations, seen a bunch of different communities. Have you, curiously, have you seen any communities come together? I mean, Obama, this weekend talked in his commencement speech about investing in community. I'd be interested in your perspective on community and the role it could play in the future of work. And, if you had some advice for us here in Waterloo Region, and as we build this out across Canada, if you had some advice on some priorities we should be thinking about as community leaders, I'd be interested in your perspective.
I think at this particular moment, I think everyone should be focused on how do we create more taxpayers? Because, in the US, it's 30 million people I have US numbers, but those are the numbers I know the best. We lost 5 million manufacturing jobs through and around the Great Recession, global financial crisis. We never had an answer for those folks. Now we have 30 million. Some of those will bounce right back. Many of them won't, and we don't have an answer. One of the things, and someone asked this question in the chat, so we'll weave the answers into both. I wrote in Forbes a few weeks ago that I think the coronavirus is the third existential challenge of our lifetimes. The first is climate change. We have failed miserably there. We've had many messengers. We've had adequate data. Haven't changed our behaviors. Second is income inequality. We have the highest levels now since the 1920s. And it's been increasing under right and left, every president. And when we increase income inequality, it's not just fair or right or any of those other issues. It actually slows down economic growth and prosperity for all of us. So if we look at this moment where, the climate had to stop, the climate's breathing finally, and we have this moment to rethink how we restart and unfreeze and get to the other side of that river. We also have the opportunity to think about how we engage more humans. And I think that's one of the things you guys do at Communitech really well, bringing businesses together, bringing universities into it, government into it. We need that public-private partnership to say, how are we going to create more taxpayers? And I use that language specifically because it depoliticizes it. That's something everybody wants to do. And institutions of learning, In the US, we have 20 million undergraduates a year. IBM said we need to, every single year. IBM says we need to retrain 120 million people worldwide in the next 3 years. 12 million are in the US. I don't have the Canada number, I'm sorry, but that's the kind of amount of learning we needed to have take place before the virus. Now look at where we are now. So we all have to be in the position of how do we inspire and unleash more human potential?
I love it. So, this has been a very challenging time, and we obviously see what's happening with COVID right in front of us. I want to end just kind of on a more of a positive note. What are some things, or what is one thing you've seen coming out of this crisis that you think is positive that's going to help shape the future of work? Carol, maybe I'll start with you.
I think, it has caused, generally speaking, employees to realize they have to be agile. And, Simon and I were speaking earlier about different types of people, those that are good with change and agility and can adapt quickly, and those that really just like to stick to their knitting, stay in their lane, and not do anything differently. And I think that, if there's one thing this has taught us, is that all of us have to be agile to varying degrees. And it's just the way of the world. I don't think this is going to change. We'll have other crises, and it's a good thing from a mindset perspective to set people up to be thinking about the positive opportunities, and not just, oh, this is bad and I've got to hide under a rock until it's over, sort of thing. So I think it's a shift in global mindset, and hopefully in a really positive fashion.
That's great, Carol. Heather?
Yeah, so the Business Roundtable group of CEOs, I think it was last summer, came forward and said that, Milton Friedman's notion that the purpose of a business is only to return value to shareholders was really short-sighted, and that we really have to put humans at the center of all businesses. Now that's being stress tested. So I think, if anything, we're entering the era of human potential, because every organization is a collection of individuals. And I've seen some interesting early research that shows that we're going to start, and we're increasingly making our purchasing decision, not just based on price, although we will, especially if there's more of a downturn, and not just based on the value we're buying, but we're thinking about that organization, not only about how they treat us as customers, but how they treat their employees. It is now an essential part of your brand, because we're humans first. And I hope that continues, as well as our appreciation and gratitude towards those who are putting their lives on the line to deliver our food and drive our buses and care for folks. I mean, I was taking my dog for a walk the other day, and there was a message in chalk all along the sidewalk in front of a bus stop saying, "Thank you, bus drivers." So some of that stuff is really cool, and I hope it continues long after the virus ebbs.
Well, I wish we would have had time to take some questions from the audience. I'm glad you're able to weave a couple of those answers in there, Heather, into your responses. I'm just going to close out the session by saying, first off, thank you very much to Heather and Carol for taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. As always, both of you are very inspiring and amazing leaders. If you haven't had a chance, I'd encourage you to pick up Heather's book, The Adaptation Advantage. I read it Easter weekend, cover to cover. It was a great read. So I'd encourage you to do that. Want to also close again by thanking our Future of Work and Learning Coalition partners for making this possible. Again, these 19 different organizations who are really driving the community conversation here in Waterloo Region and beyond. And I encourage you to sign up for our next Future of Work and Learning webinar series on June 16th. We'll focus on relearning in the era of COVID-19, and we'll be joined by Jeremy Auger, who's the Chief Strategy Officer from Desire to Learn, and a number of very interesting panelists. So the link to the registration will be in the post-event email. And to learn more about what we're doing here at Communitech around the future of work and learning, you can sign up for our newsletter using the cool QR code or by visiting our website. So again, Heather and Carol, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. And I think our audience got a lot out of the conversation today, and look forward to future conversations.
Thanks for having me. And Simon, I'll send you a couple of links that people are asking for in the questions so they can
Thank
get.
you very much. Really appreciate that, Heather. And
Okay.
thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.